Thanks, Jerry. And thank you, Dr. Say, for being with us today and for giving us a thought-provoking presentation. I want to add a few thoughts around the crisis in South Sudan to build on some of the themes that Laura has already mentioned and the role that we have as both external actors and the realities of peacebuilding and governance and rule of law dynamics inside these countries that are still, I think, very much trying to find the contract that I know you all have talked about some already between state and society, right? What kind of states do African citizens want from their governments, from their leaders, from their elite? And we see this struggle happening in different ways and facets across many of our countries on the continent right now that we've touched on some already, and we'll go a little deeper on a few more. But to recall our discussion from yesterday afternoon and Dr. Williams' presentation on his book, War and Conflict in Africa, which I want to tell you all that we're working to see if we can get some copies brought over here. So stay posted. We'll give you an update on that since I know there was a lot of interest in that very solid piece of research and literature that supports a lot of our discussions. But if you'll recall, the point that I found striking for us yesterday in our discussion, and I think picks up on the challenges that we have in both the DRC and in South Sudan in various ways, is how do we reconceptualize peacemaking efforts in the political marketplace as an ongoing process of bargaining designed to demilitarize politics and institutions that sustain war. So in South Sudan, we already have a situation where we have a state-based armed conflict. We have many localized levels of non-state armed conflict, as we do in different ways in eastern DRC. But now we've got a situation where the last 3 years we see a very serious and, in fact, I think a pre-genocidal state of affairs in South Sudan, with the state attacking its own civilians, attacking the political opposition attacking back, fragmentation of the opposition, and really a devastating situation where nearly the entire country is now engulfed in a conflict dynamic in a very serious and destructive way. We also have a really grave humanitarian situation on top of the armed violence taking place, affecting civilians. And that has to do with the food insecurity in the country and the fact that really 3/4 of the population now require assistance, and 40% of the country, which is nearly 5 million people, are at a severe level of food insecurity. That means that we have famine in some parts of South Sudan already, and that the situation is only likely to get worse given the trajectory of the conflict, given the breakdown of markets, given the inability of South Sudanese to pursue their traditional livelihoods, whether that's farming or herding animals or fishing or other means of providing for their families. And so we really have a country that's been brought to its knees, and it's fundamentally due to a political crisis. And I think Dr. Williams' book really hits the nail on the head for South Sudan in any event, when he talks about the way that the nature of armed conflict and the consequence of state-society relationships and how it's evolved or not in South Sudan has really become a question of regime survival for the government and for the ruling elite there. And what we've seen is an instrumentalization of disorder and using violence to assert authority, right? So the state institutions struggle to maintain legitimacy among their domestic populations, and the political strategy of the regime is to seek to preserve its privileged status, which is quite simply to control what few resources remain, since oil, the primary source of government revenues, has nearly ceased to function as a market. Peter can give us some statistics, I think, in terms of how far down oil production has dropped. Dr. Luca as well has looked at this closely in terms of the challenges for the government and the revenues. And there's almost nothing left to fight over, and yet we see this very devastating fight taking place. We have a challenge in our peacemaking efforts and in our response to the crisis in South Sudan. And we have a challenge to recognize the political nature of the crisis and to appreciate that we have a role as the external actors in this situation. I think everybody is probably familiar with the role of the United States in helping South Sudan to come to its moment of self-determination as part of the Troika of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway that worked very closely with the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, to bring about the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which provided the framework for South Sudan to choose its independence from Sudan. And in fact, to celebrate its independence in 2011. We have a responsibility as the largest bilateral donor, the United States, to South Sudan, as the key backer to the fight for self-determination and for South Sudanese to decide what kind of state do they want to live in and how do they want to be governed, as opposed to the political dispensation that existed when it was united in one country with Khartoum. But what we've seen, especially since December of 2013, when this current civil war broke out, is that the people of South Sudan have not been afforded the voice in what kind of state they live in South Sudan. And we've unfortunately witnessed now this total instrumentalization of power and violence for regime survival. So the question is, what do we do to interrupt that? How can we end the descent further into the worst case scenarios that we could imagine? Violence and mass atrocities on a scale that we've seen few times in history is where we stand right now in South Sudan. And this is challenging. This challenges both African state building and peace building. It challenges Western concepts of state building and peace building. So far, we've arrived at a peace agreement and multiple ceasefire agreements, none of which have succeeded in arresting the situation. And in fact, by every metric we can look at, level of violence, what little we know about the numbers of people who are dying, and we don't have very good measurements of that, except by extrapolating from the gravity of the situation, both in terms of the humanitarian consequences and the sheer volume of fighting, the displaced populations that are leaving home areas and even leaving the country now. South Sudan has more than 1 million refugees outside its borders. I think one of only 4 countries in the world where that's the situation these days. So it continues to deteriorate and to grow worse by every metric, which means to me that our peace building, our peacemaking efforts aren't working thus far. And the political agreement that was arrived at last August in 2015 between President Salva Kiir and the leading opposition figure, the former first vice president, Dr. Riek Machar, has now failed completely, in my view. We saw Dr. Machar return to Juba in April of this year, 2016, but only a few months later, in July, we had full-scale fighting again in Juba, and a really a brutal situation and firefight taking place between the guard forces of President Kiir and Riek Machar. And the result being that Dr. Machar fled the city, and after being chased around the rural areas of Equatoria for some time, he ultimately fled the country And as many of you probably have seen from the news, he was picked up and taken to Khartoum and now is on in South Africa and is outside the country. Critically, from the international response side, we have taken an interesting stance in the replacement of Riek Machar in the current political agreement, this power-sharing arrangement that the peace agreement provided for. And another gentleman named Taban Deng Gai was appointed by President Kiir to replace Riek as the first vice president. The problem with this is that Taban Deng Gai does not have the constituency that Dr. Machar has. He doesn't represent the opposition. And in fact, it contributes to the perception across South Sudan that the government in Juba is a one-sided government and is not even inclusive of two sides, never mind the further fragmentation of ethnicities and of regions and political constituencies across the country. So the unfortunate conclusion from this is that South Sudanese who don't see that the government provides services, provides safety. In fact, they see the opposite from the government right now in terms of the impact on their lives. And the only political recourse is to give up and surrender to a government that seems to be predicated on a very narrow political and increasingly ethnic differentiation. That means there's no political pathway for most of the country's citizens to engage in the discussion and the dialogue about what is the relationship between the citizen and the state. Whether we're talking about security services, whether we're talking about other basic public services, whether we're talking about the distribution of the country's natural resources and wealth, whether we're talking about political representation at the national or the state or the local level. And for many more reasons, the conflict and the crisis now continues to spiral. So Dr. Luca and Peter know that I have a very provocative proposition for South Sudan, which I will just share briefly so that we can open up a discussion and a dialogue about what do we do for countries in this very vexing situation where the political leadership and the elite seem to be seeking self-preservation. They're seeking a very narrow set of interests, and the vast majority of the population is increasingly pushed out of not just the political marketplace and the political discussion, but is in fact being preyed upon in the case of South Sudan in a very brutal way, and we hope the situation in Congo doesn't devolve to that extent across the country. Because the impact, before I get to my proposition, the impact of either of these situations continuing to fester and to deteriorate is not just for the people of those countries themselves. The regional spillover effects are immense. And in fact, in this case, we're talking about two very large countries, Congo even larger than South Sudan, but with many neighboring states. And we know that instability in your neighbor is not a good predictor for your own instability if you're next door, whether political or economic or social. And so this poses challenges for us in regions in both East and Central Africa, where we have a number of tough situations in terms of political crises and potential for greater domestic instability and therefore regional instability and conflict. So my proposition for South Sudan, in fact, and you can see some of this on the website. I testified recently before our Senate Foreign Relations Committee and have written a little bit about this. My proposition is that South Sudan has come to such a grave condition that we need to give it a pause. And we need to take the electoral contest and the political contest off the table for the time being. So what does that mean? That means I believe that there should be an external administration of the country for a finite period of time. And during that time, the international administration of the country, which would have to be requested by South Sudanese, it would have to be under the auspices somehow of the United Nations and the African Union. It would have to provide for the basic safety and security for the country and really the minimal level of public services for people in South Sudan to stabilize in terms of the humanitarian situation, to resume their livelihoods, to be able to not live in fear, not have to hide out in swamps and in protection of civilian sites protected by the UN mission in South Sudan and other grave measures, so that we can restore just a base level of stability and normalcy, so that the country can undergo two fundamental processes. The first being on reconciliation and accountability. The social fabric of the country has really been torn apart and further aggrieved over these last 3 years of conflict. We all know that there's decades-long conflict that took place in South Sudan as part of the North-South War. And on top of that, now we have this very, very vicious civil war inside South Sudan. And so there's proper accountability that South Sudanese need to decide what does that mean and look like for their leaders and for the actors who've been involved in this fighting. But that takes time. And that can't happen while there's a famine going on, and that can't happen while there's ongoing violence and armed conflict taking place. So we have to stop both of those things first. And then secondly, South Sudanese need to have the national conversation around what kind of state do they want. And what should their constitution enshrine in terms of these principles of democratic accountability. And I don't know if Dr. Siegel used this in his presentation on governance last week, but if you pick up the research paper on South Sudan that's in the back of the room, or you look at it online, the key thing is not that I wrote it. The key thing is two figures that are in here that you can flip through quickly and find. And the first figure shows a schematic, basically, of a system of government with a dominant role of the executive branch, or a context of what Dr. Siegel calls limited accountability. And the second figure shows this sort of universe-looking figure, shows what we're striving for in terms of a state-society relationship, an ecosystem of layered accountability. This means the formal and the informal institutions that must interact with each other to protect citizens and give them voice, and to make sure that social compact between the state and the society remains healthy and accountable to what the people of the country really want. And I just commend this to you because I think this has relevance in many respects across very different contexts in Africa and, frankly, around the world. We're all continuing to strive to build out our state-society relationship, to keep it current with the challenges that societies are facing. We have stresses in America as well, where we're continuing to have this dialogue as a country. You're getting to watch us do that while you're here this week, but certainly in our own relationships with our security sectors, our police forces. This is a very deep and important conversation, national conversation happening here in the United States. And it's important that we have these different avenues and pathways for having the conversation. So legitimate political opposition that is allowed to function and to speak out and to have voice. media that has the freedom to report independently and objectively, civil society that can help to hold us as government officials accountable, our elected politicians accountable, where we can continue to have these discussions. These are all vital components of that layered accountability structure. And it challenges us. It challenges us as national actors in our own countries, all of us respectively, and it challenges us as external actors, whether external from the West or external meaning the neighbor next door or across the continent in the regional construct, in terms of what is our role and responsibility when that relationship and that accountability structure becomes so distorted that we have this terrible situation of mass violence and citizens who are suffering tremendously. So I will stop us there, and I think Jerry will take us into a discussion, but I welcome to have your comments back and for Dr. Say as well, so that we can think through this together. And of course, if colleagues are interested to hear from Dr. Luca or Peter, they have some good thoughts as well from the South Sudanese perspective of how do we find the way forward for South Sudan out of this crisis.